Okay. Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography here at CUNY. And over the past 11 years, the Levy Center has awarded 44 major fellowships to working biographers. 4 such 72,000 fellowships are awarded each year. To date, 18 biographies have been published, including Ruth Franklin's biography of Shirley Jackson, which just won the prestigious National Books Critics Circle Award for biography last year. And there are many more books being published in the next year. We are now recruiting students, I want to say, for a brand new 2-year master's degree program in biography. Nothing like it exists anywhere else in the country. Hosted by the Levy Center, this rigorous degree program will teach budding biographers and memoirists how to research and write in this popular genre. It is not too late to apply, even for the coming September-autumn season. Our last event of the academic year will take place next Monday, June 3rd, featuring Eric Foner in conversation with Brenda Wineapple about Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Very timely topic. But tonight we are honored to have Danny Goldberg in conversation with Eric Alterman. Danny is a rock star in the music business. I mean, he may not sing, but he has been writing about rock and roll since he covered Woodstock in 1969. And since then, he has authored 5 books about our music, culture, and politics. But along the way, he has also worked on the inside of the music business, facilitating the work of such seminal artists as Led Zeppelin, Bonnie Raitt, the Allman Brothers, Steve Earle, the Cranberries, and Kurt Cobain's Nirvana. Eric Alterman is a whole other story. I have known Eric since the late 1970s, or maybe early 80s, and Eric is not a rock star, but a political journalist and Nation magazine columnist. So you may ask why he is interviewing Danny Goldberg tonight about Kurt Cobain. Well, I recall visiting Eric at Bethany Beach, maybe in the summer of 1991. He was then working on his PhD dissertation, all about politics. But he was listening to this very loud rock and roll music. I mean, it was shaking the walls of the beach house. I asked him who was singing, and of course it was Nirvana, I think playing Smells Like Teen Spirit. Anyway, I have Eric to thank for introducing me to this little Seattle band. They will have a conversation for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A, and afterwards, Danny has agreed to sign books at the back with Books on Call NYC. So, Eric, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kai, I think.
I just want to know, I think you're a rock star.
You and my mother, but she's forgotten. So Danny and I are good friends, you should know that. We've been friends since, I looked it up recently, since 2004, because I was doing an article for the Atlantic magazine on how to raise liberal money in Hollywood. And the first person I went to was Danny, because even though Danny was living and working in New York, at the time, he was president of the Southern California American Civil Liberties Union. And Kai kind of undersold my writing about music, but he also undersold Danny's knowledge, extensive knowledge and involvement in politics as well as music. One annoying thing about Danny is that he really is he's a music executive, but he's also a great writer. And that's annoying, I think. But I'm a historian. My PhD is in history, and that's how I look at things, including music. So I want to start off, like I said, Danny and I have been close friends, but for the longest time, I never talked to him about Kurt Cobain, because it was so painful for him. He he couldn't talk about it. I once bought a box set of early Nirvana stuff, and I asked Danny what he thought of it, and he wouldn't listen to it. He couldn't deal with it. And this book was the first time he's really gone back and dealt with it, and it's a great book, but it's also a form of therapy. With that said, as I said, I'm a historian, so I look at this from a historian's perspective. Danny, can you tell us who and where you were when Nirvana came into your life?
I had a personal management company in Los
No,
Angeles.
but how you got there. Tell us about yourself and how you landed in that spot.
Okay, well, I was 40, so a lot of my
You can
life
skip
had
a lot of
gone
it.
by.
I don't want to hear about how you lost your virginity.
Between Woodstock and all that. But by this time, I had a management company called Gold Mountain, which is an anglicized way of saying Goldberg. And it was, our biggest client then was Bonnie Raitt, who had just won the Grammy for 4 Grammys, including Album of the Year, and the Allmans and some others. And I knew that earlier in the year of 1990, I had hired a young guy named John Silva because I knew there was this new generation of rock music emerging, a new audience and new artists, and I was not personally attuned to them. John was. He was, in his early 20s, and had the music nerd's obsession with 7 inches and fanzines, and went to a zillion shows. And together we signed the band Sonic Youth, who was the most, arguably the most influential artist of the alternative indie world, except they were switching from being indie to signing to Geffen Records, which is why they wanted management. And they Thurston Moore, who I spoke to for the book, was a guitar player lead guitar player and one of the singers of Sonic Youth, and one of the great curators of that generation's music, touted me on how brilliant Nirvana was. And even though I was hesitant to meet with new bands, because it usually takes a while to get paid, I totally trusted him. From their point of view, Kurt and Chris Novoselic, who had started Nirvana, and their then pretty new drummer, Dave Grohl, who I think had joined the band a month earlier, came down to Los Angeles to meet with us because they had put out one independent record called Bleach that had become very celebrated in the indie world, but they were frustrated that they weren't, they'd go into towns and the records wouldn't be in the stores, and they wanted to take advantage of the buzz and the subculture they had by following Sonic Youth's path to the major label world, which was by that time doable without giving up any of your artistic control. And so they came to my office and we had a meeting, and after that we were their manager. They trusted us, I think, for the same reason that I was interested in them, was a faith in the judgment of Sonic Youth.
And can you sketch briefly? The next question I'm going to ask you is, where did Nirvana come from, and tell me a little about that scene. But before I ask you that, I want to know when that whole scene burst forth, what was the music business looking like at the time?
All right, well, the time I'm describing is sort of the fall of 1990. And the rock and roll business, which was the part of the business I knew the best, was very, very dominated commercially by the impact of MTV, which was by then ubiquitous and was the one national way that music was exposed. That had created a subculture that was known as hair bands, which is these, lead singers of kind of metal-influenced pop rock bands who had very long hair that looked great on MTV, often with a fan off camera blowing it. That included bands, long-forgotten bands like White Lion and Winger and Poison. And the biggest rock band in America then was Guns N' Roses, who was at their peak. Meanwhile, all during the 80s, there was a subculture of bands that were playing to much smaller audiences on indie labels that developed a passionate culture that influenced the members of Nirvana, bands that I, at the time, was not that familiar with, but which I tried to learn a little bit about in my role as managing Nirvana, such as Black Flag and Flipper and Dead Kennedys, Fugazi, and others. Many and others. They were on mostly indie labels.
Fugazi is the band that Beto O'Rourke really identified with for some reason.
Well, they were political.
Yeah.
The two most political of the punk bands were the Dead Kennedys and Fugazi. But their politics were, I dare to say, more radical than Beto's. Nirvana became signed in Seattle. Kurt and Chris Novoselic grew up in Aberdeen, a small town, a couple hours outside of Seattle. But they made Seattle was a bigger city, and there was an indie label there called Sub Pop, which still exists, and we're kind of, I think they coined the word grunge. I mean, Michael Azrat, who's the best historian of this era, is here tonight, so if I'm screwing this up, please forgive me. But anyway, so Nirvana emerged out of that punk influence scene. But even on Bleach, the first album they made on this indie label, Kurt wrote a melodic song called About a Girl that was clearly influenced kind of by the Beatles, and he always had this other side of him, that he loved the punk culture and the rebelliousness. Again, this all took place, these bands all grew up against the backdrop of the presidencies of Reagan, and there was a huge, sort of hatred of Reagan that fueled a lot of the lyrics of some of the bands, but he had much more diverse musical interests. And they all loved the Beatles. The members of Nirvana would coyly refer to it as the B word, because it was like not necessarily cool, but the sheer artistry and brilliance of it definitely inspired Kurt. And he also liked certain heavy metal music, even though he hated the misogyny of a lot of the metal culture. So you could even hear some of that on this first indie label record called Bleach. And clearly that was a harbinger of where he wanted to go with the next record, which is the one that, made them so successful.
People sometimes say, who decided to have the Renaissance in Florence in the 14th century? What made Seattle the place?
I don't really know. I don't know why all those great musicians came from Muscle Shoals either, or, why Liverpool produced, the bands that it produced. There just seems to be certain places, sometimes it's low rents, sometimes there's some support system. In the case of the Northwest, Olympia, Washington was the home of Evergreen State College, and there was a college radio station there that played, by their rules, 80% indie music, and became a breeding ground for a lot of creativity. But it's just one of those things. It is true that within a very short length of time, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and Alice in Chains, 4 rock bands all had, selling over 1 million records, So, but it was just the weird cycles of culture. There's no particular reason for it, but this does happen. It happened obviously in San Francisco in the '60s, and there are waves of creativity that come through certain communities for certain times. Definitely affordable rent is one consistent through line of all of such communities.
Now, Bleach is a pretty uncompromising record. It's very noisy and takes some getting used to. You were there for the transition to the album that sold 18 million copies or something, and you write about a lot about this in this book. There's this tension that I suppose all serious artists have between wanting to have the biggest possible audience and the biggest possible impact, but staying true to what inspired them in the first place and the community that supported them. So, can you tell us a bit about how Kurt and the rest of the band dealt with that tension?
Well, you know, Kurt was the songwriter, first of all. He wrote virtually all of the songs. He was the lead singer and he was the lead guitar player. So I definitely view Nirvana through Kurt-colored glasses for the, you know, and my own relationship with the band centered around him for various reasons that I go into, and he knew who he was as an artist all along. I mean, people, you know, he wrote a Beatles song on Bleach. He always had a sense of melody and choruses, and was a craftsman when it came to songwriting, and had complete creative control over everything he did for his entire career. Particularly after I met him, I was not around when he made Bleach, but everything after that, it was never even questioned. So whatever tension was a creative tension inside his head, and it was about, but I think it was mainly just doing what he wanted to do, and then the tension was more dealing with the reaction to what he wanted to do as an artist. I don't think he changed anything he wanted to do as an artist, because part of what he wanted to do as an artist was reach a lot of people. That's who he was. That was always part of his vision. And you know, at some point, you know, some of his journals were published 10 or 15 years ago, and you could see him at a very young age, you know, envisioning success, even while he was still very loyal to the rebellious elements of punk rock. So as an artist, he did exactly what he wanted to do. Managing the reaction to it was where the tension came in, how to deal with the fact that he started out playing music for one subculture, and now, you know, a mass audience that included the kind of people that would kick his ass when he was in high school were at festivals hearing him play, and trying to deal with his desire to stay successful without pandering to people that he had no respect for. Those kind of tensions he had to deal with. And he just was a master at understanding the symbolism of different choices that he made, so that he could kind of keep these multiple audiences all together. And he created kind of a coalition of pop, you know, mainstream rock fans, metal fans, punk fans, you know, that people would come to a Nirvana show that probably had never been in the same room before at a concert.
Did you have a sense, I mean, when we talk about, a few times we talked about Kurt in the past few years, you said the name you always bring up as the only comparison you could think of is John Lennon. Did you have a sense of who Kurt's genius, of where, in other words, what sense did you have of Kurt's genius when you were working with him and when you met him, and how did that come about?
Well, it took me a little while to figure out, you know, how talented he was. You know, I was busy with a lot of things, and it was only a few months after we signed them that I actually saw the band play live, and that's when I really realized how special he was, because he had this uncanny ability to create intimacy with an audience. They did a show while Nevermind was kind of being rehearsed, where they opened to another band called Dinosaur Jr., and I just went because I'd never seen them, and I thought, I guess I should see the band once if I'm their manager. People are always surprised when I say that, but that's the norm with me, is, you know, they have to, at least half the time, I see people after I decide to manage them. But so I realized that he was a genius in terms of his ability to empathize with and connect with an audience. It was just some intangible thing. And then obviously when I heard the songs that were going to be on Nevermind, they were great songs. I mean, Smells Like Teen Spirit sounded great even before it was finished. And they had already made demos of In Bloom and Lithium and Polly, which were 3 songs on Nevermind, and they were all remarkable songs. You know, they had these very catchy melodies and impeccable craftsmanship in terms of song structure, but very intense, weird lyrics that clearly it was a very distinctive, you know, artistic voice. So somewhere between the time I met him but before Nevermind came out, I realized how important he was going to be to me and how important the band could be, and you know, created more space to pay attention to them. And then after that record, Nevermind, came out, it became very, very successful very, very quickly. So it quickly, within weeks of it coming out, it became the most important thing that I was involved with.
One of the many reasons I'm jealous of Danny's life is that when he was seriously like 19 years old. Practically his first professional job was being the press guy for Led Zeppelin, flying around the world.
Well, I was 22
Whatever.
for Led Zeppelin.
So was your experience with Led Zeppelin helpful to you and to the band in terms of navigating their enormous stardom? And
Well, I don't know that I think the band kind of liked the idea that I'd work with Zeppelin. Zeppelin
well, they're both
legendary
three bands of 3 people, well, 4 people with Led Zeppelin, but they were small groups. They were small groups making big noise.
There was definitely one more person in Led Zeppelin than there was in Nirvana. This is for sure. They were, they grew up knowing who Zeppelin
3
was.
musicians, 1
And
singer.
Dave Grohl in particular idolized John Bonham as a drummer, and that was sort of the only conversations I can ever remember having with Dave were, trying to remember another anecdote about John Bonham. For me, my boss when I was the PR guy for Led Zeppelin was Peter Grant, their manager, and he was the first manager I spent a lot of time with, and he was a very intimidating and powerful figure in the music business, and it was a small group of us, so I worked for him. I spent a lot of time in rooms just with him, and his philosophy about what the role of a manager was still, defines my notion of what the job is, which is, we work for the artist. What the artist wants is all that matters. Fuck the record company, fuck the concert promoters, fuck the media. What the artist is at the center of all this, and what they want is what matters, and our job is to work for them. And it seems kind of obvious from a fan's point of view, but within the context of the business, it certainly wasn't always that way. The record companies in certain circumstances had control, and the way the money was divided was really changed by Peter Grant as Zeppelin's manager. So that sort of imprinted on me a notion of the primacy of the artist relative to the rest of the business. So in that respect, it influenced me. But the business was quite different by the 91 when Nevermind came out compared to 69 or 70 when Zeppelin's first record came out, and it was and Nirvana cared about things that Zeppelin didn't care about. Nirvana had a political component to them and a commitment to a subculture that was different from the way Zeppelin carried themselves. So, there were some similarities, but not that many.
The way you talk about the band tonight and in the book, it's more like it's Kurt Cobain and his band, like Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. But it was Nirvana, it wasn't Kurt Cobain. So what can you tell us about how Kurt worked inside the band, how he dealt with that?
Well, there were just 3 of them, and they were certainly like the 3 amigos when I met them. It was them. They'd be in these, traveling around the country. They were together all the time. They shared the same taste in music, the same values. They were approximately the same generation. Chris was the oldest. Kurt was kind of the middle, and I think Dave was the youngest, but they came, the same generation, and they had the same values. Chris and Kurt had known each other much longer than either of them knew Dave. They knew each other in Aberdeen, this little town they came from, and I say Chris was like the big brother that Kurt never had, but without the sibling rivalry, And even when I spoke to Chris for the book, I mean, his love for Kurt was so palpable, and he maybe was one of the first people to ever really truly get how brilliant Kurt was, because just seeing him as a teenager and the way he approached what he was doing as a songwriter and in terms of rehearsal and the work ethic and all that stuff. And they'd been through quite a few drummers. I think Dave was the 4th drummer of the band, and definitely by far the best. And there was no question that they were very grateful to have such a talented drummer in the band, and that was sort of part of that same turn in the road for them that led them to us, to having a management and to being on a major label, was to get a drummer that was that great. So, they all, initially they got along, and they were kind of, like I said, the three amigos, but in terms of all the creative decisions, in my witnessing of it, the other 2 guys always deferred to Kurt. He was the visionary that created the music. But you're right, it was a band, and they had a particular chemistry together, and they made a certain sound together that was unique. And but I do. I am kind of a curt chauvinist, because just on observing like what he actually did was literally making all the creative decisions.
And you had a professional relationship with Courtney Love also?
I later did, what about a month after Nevermind came out, they played a club called the Metro in Chicago. I didn't go to all the Nirvana shows, but I did go to that one. And Courtney came into the dressing room, introduced herself to me. I'd heard about her. They were going to do a pro-choice benefit that Nirvana was headlining, that Hole, her band, was going to be on a couple of weeks after that. And, about 10 minutes later, I saw her sitting on Kurt's lap in the back of the dressing room, and they both had this very happy expression on their face, kind of like the proverbial cat that swallowed the canary. And they were together for the rest of his life, after that. So I quickly recognized that he was in love with her, and that was I had a lot of disadvantages in the group of people around Nirvana by being older and being from another kind of rock and roll generation and being the business guy and not being part of the punk rock world. But in terms of recognizing that relationship, I think being older was an advantage. I think a lot of people around the band thought it was just not going to last, and it was a rock and roll, 1 week stand or something like that. And that's where I kind of developed a closer personal relationship with him, is because I kind of honored that. And I was sitting with him, and Hole was looking for a manager, and I said, and they were talking to different managers, and I just said, you think it would be a good idea if I managed Hole? And he said, oh, that would be so awesome. Like, I was kind of validating him. It wasn't a big stretch. I mean, Hole had their own reputation. They'd already made one indie record too. They were kind of in the same similar trajectory that Nirvana had been on maybe a year earlier. So then I managed that band for about a year. Later, I went to work for Atlantic Records, but still involved with Nirvana, primarily to deal with Kurt, because I had to become the business person that he wanted to talk to about stuff. And at that point, Hole then found different management, but I worked with them for about a year, and I did make their major label deal with Geffen. And I'm a fan of Courtney's and consider her a friend. She was pretty helpful in doing the book, and definitely was part of his life from that night on. And it was Kurt and Courtney. There's just no question about that.
Tell us about your discovery and dealing with Kurt's heroin habit.
Nevermind came out in September of '91, and in the first week of January of '92, approximately 3 months later, they were booked to be the musical guest on Saturday Night Live. Which was a big deal for any artist, and I think they were only the second artist with any kind of punk aura to get that slot. The Clash had done it a few years earlier.
There was that whole Sex Pistols, Elvis Costello thing.
Yeah, I kind of always put Elvis Costello in a different lane than punk, but he was anyway.
Back then he was a punk, then he grew. Anyway. Third.
Anyway, it was a big deal. It was a big, I said band. It was a big deal.
The band, the Attractions.
It was a big deal to do it, and it coincided with Nevermind going to #1 on the Billboard chart, which was the kind of chart that everyone looked at as being the closest to accurate. And it replaced the Michael Jackson record as #1, which was just this ridiculously unthinkable thing only weeks earlier. So it was a euphoric moment in terms of just the capstone of that last few months. But unfortunately, that also was the time when a lot of us, including me, realized that he was doing heroin. So it was a bittersweet day and night. There had been 2 articles that came out. In those days, the internet was in its infancy, so the big thing was faxes. And we'd been faxed 2 articles that West Coast journalists had done the week before that both alluded to the fact that he looked like he was on heroin. And that was the shock that kind of when, getting to New York and seeing those two faxes, and then seeing him at the rehearsal, he was definitely stoned. So that was the moment.
So I want you to tell the story of the Vanity Fair article, but first I want to know, what did you do or say when you discovered this?
Well, if a bunch of us just talked about the need to try to do some kind of intervention, which we scheduled, I think, for about 10 days after that. They were in New York for a couple of days. They did Saturday Night Live, and then they had to do a session they'd agreed to do at MTV to go into the studio and kind of just do some of the songs on Nevermind live to give MTV more content. And Kurt was definitely into playing ball with MTV. He watched it himself. He liked it when his videos were on MTV. He didn't like it when Pearl Jam's videos were on MTV more than Nirvana's were. And he didn't do everything they wanted, but he did a lot of stuff that they asked him to do, including that. And so I called. At that time, Aerosmith had made a big comeback and were known to have become sober. And their manager, Tim Collins, was sober and was considered, the manager that had most effectively helped a client.
So you had never faced this problem before with any of the people you managed?
No, not. I've been around artists with the drug problem, unfortunately, before, but I was never in the position I was in with an artist where it was on me to try to solve the problem or think of a potential solution to the problem. So that was a new role. I definitely seen people on drugs before, including on heroin. But so he recommended a guy who's dead now, so I'm allowed to say his name and disparage him, named Bob Timmons, who had cultivated a reputation of being a guy that could help rock musicians get sober. And so he was supposed to be our advisor at this intervention that we staged at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in LA, approximately a week after Saturday Night Live, maybe 8 or 9 days, something like that. And this was also a point at which Courtney had just like that day, I think, or maybe the day before, realized that she was pregnant. And Timmons was so freaked out by this that he just left, right after about 10 minutes of the intervention, leaving us to fend for ourselves with a doctor at Cedars-Sinai that supposedly was an expert on chemical dependence. So it was kind of weird, but we did persuade Kurt and Courtney to both go into rehab and get treatment, and they both did. And for the next 7 or 8 months, it worked, but it didn't last.
Okay, and then when did that Lynn Hirschberg's Vanity Fair article hit?
In August. I would never know all these dates if I hadn't just had to map it out, but now I do, So in August of '92, approximately 1 week before Kurt and Courtney's daughter Frances was born, this feature article is published in Vanity Fair. There was a profile of Courtney by Lynn Hirschberg, who's a name brand Vanity Fair celebrity profiler. It was not complimentary. I think Courtney had been on such a roll. She was accomplished so many things over the last couple of years, putting her band together, getting Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth to produce the first record, falling in love with and marrying Kurt, getting signed herself to Geffen, having a lot of good press along the way, that she had a sense of omnipotence in dealing with the media particularly. She's incredibly smart, articulate, charming person when she wants to be, and it had, was on a big winning streak, and overestimated her charm when she dealt with Lynn Hirschberg, and the article was very, made Kurt and Courtney both look like kind of Sid and Nancy, just junkies who were decadent, and accused her, had unnamed sources claiming that Courtney had continued to shoot heroin after she knew she was pregnant, which caused a huge crisis, because the the local authorities in LA didn't look kindly on that. It was high profile enough that it took them months to actually get legal custody of their own daughter, and there was a whole mechanism that a bunch of us had to create to have them stay with their daughter, but have Courtney's half-sister be the official guardian until the Department of Social Services, or whatever it was called in LA County, deemed that they had done the responsible thing. And that was sort of created a permanent sense of embattlement and paranoia, that Kurt had about the media after that. That was a definite unwelcome result of being successful. In doing this, a lot of people have said to me, gee, wasn't Kurt like so freaked out by being successful? And wasn't that one of the things that brought on his early demise? I don't believe that. He wanted very much to be successful, and he wanted to stay successful. It wasn't like he had this big success and then hit out. He did quite a few things after that, including, In Utero, an extremely successful record, The Unplugged, and a lot of other things to maintain the success. But he hated the invasion into his personal life and the way it made him and Courtney look, and he didn't like it when people were mean to her. So that was a big bummer, and it's a long chapter in the book.
Yeah, you're still mad about it. Read the book and you'll be mad about it too. Tell us about the final days.
I, by this time, was working in New York. I had become president of Atlantic Records, was commuting back and forth to Los Angeles, where my family was still living at that time. And one time in March of '94, I get this call, and he's overdosed in Rome on some pharmaceutical. I think it was Rohypnol. I could never keep track of all these drugs, these pharmaceuticals, and he almost died then. And I remember Courtney and I praying on the phone, and he came out of it. And I only saw, I talked to him on the phone. I didn't see him again until approximately a month later, when Courtney called me and asked me to be part of a second intervention, second one for me. I imagine there were other confrontational moments with different other people between the two, but I was only at the two of them. There was a woman named Janet Billig who I had hired when I was at the management company, who stayed there when I went to Atlantic and did a lot of the day-to-day stuff with both Kurt and Courtney. She was one of the closest people to both of them, and she also lived in New York, and she and I and drug counselor dude who she found at Courtney's request flew out to Seattle and, begged him to stop doing heroin, and he was not in a good mood about it. Didn't like being invaded in his own home by well-meaning people that didn't understand what he was going through at that moment. But he it's widely known. He did go into rehab again, as did Courtney. He left rehab and then killed himself a couple of days later. I think the day that he's believed to have killed himself was April 5th, according to the coroner. But the day I and the rest of the world found out about it was April 8th. When the body was discovered.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Kurt's afterlife. First of all, there's
Say about Kurt's what?
afterlife, in the culture.
The impact of his art. Yeah.
That. But first, I want you to describe and dispose of the various conspiracy theories that. You deal with this in the book, as I recall.
Well, yeah, I'll recapitulate what I said in the book. I've become a little I did one in LA where somebody recorded it, and it's on YouTube, and then it's been the source of a series of comments accusing me of being part of a cover-up of a murder. So I'm hesitant to add.
You're big enough to handle a few comments on YouTube
to the fire. But in a nutshell, Kurt and Courtney were both in rehab, and then he left. Courtney was very worried about him, and when I was in Seattle and trying to convince Kurt to get into rehab, at one point, he got very upset and said what he really needed was a therapist, and he picked up a copy of the Yellow Pages and looking under T for therapists, because he felt that was the only way he could get one that wasn't going to be manipulated by somebody presumably like me that would have presumably some agenda. And so this was kind of, I knew he was out of his mind. It didn't upset me, but it was kind of an amazing concept. Apparently, this theory of picking people from the Yellow Pages to avoid manipulation was something he and Courtney had discussed as a good tactic in dealing with the world, because she picked this private detective out of the Yellow Pages, whose job was to then try to find Kurt. And after Kurt, and he went up to Seattle and did not find the body. That was found a day or two later. But after Kurt died, the detective was so, I think, amazed. This is now my opinion. I can't read the dude's mind. But he, the death was on the front page of the New York Times and, on the evening news, and was an international story. And I met this detective once after the fact, and he was working, as far as I can tell, either a one-person office, or maybe there was a secretary who just wasn't there that day. It was kind of the lowest side of the seedy Hollywood PI. He decided that Kurt had been murdered and has been peddling this theory for 25 years. So there's a cult of people who believe this. The Seattle Police Department investigated at the time, determined it was a suicide, and then some years later, after these people made enough noise, reopened the investigation and again concluded that it was a suicide. And it's my opinion that it was a suicide, as it is Chris Novoselic's opinion and most people close to Kurt. But I can't speak for everybody. I wasn't there when he died, so I don't know with certainty. But he was suicidal. He was depressed. He did get a gun. There's no question about that. And he's dead. Okay. And I believe he killed himself.
Have you been?
But these people go on Twitter every day. There's a tweet. I noticed you got one or two.
I didn't notice
suggesting questions about this, but.
Well, now we've taken care of it. There'll be no questions about Kurt's murder, taken, quote unquote murder. But are you gratified? Are you surprised by the bigness of Kurt's role in contemporary music?
I'm really not surprised. I mean, just being there when Smells Like Teen Spirit became such a phenomenon, and it wasn't just a hit song. There's been other big hit songs. It changed kind of the musical formats. It redefined what commercial was, and it also, almost immediately, he became a figure that was more than just a singer and a writer of popular songs, who somehow was getting at the inner life of teenagers and dealing with their loneliness and sense of alienation in a way that only very few artists did, to me, the way Bob Dylan did for me, and the way, I dare say, Bruce has done for you. He was that for that generation of fans. That was clear quite quickly, and it was global. This book's been translated into a dozen languages, which is certainly a first for me. And it's obviously because of him, not much as I'm proud of my writing. It's because of what he meant to people in Eastern Europe and Latin America, Japan, all over Western Europe, and anywhere where people bought, there were Saudi Arabian bootlegs, cassettes of Nevermind and In Utero. So I knew how important he was to people, and artists that are that important to people usually stay that important to people. There's something about whatever music you liked when you were a teenager usually stays with you. I still listen to Blonde on Blonde, and people that were 16 or 15 or 14 when Nevermind came out, I think still listen to that when they're a certain frame of mind. So I'm not really that surprised. I lived through enough, I witnessed enough what his impact was as an artist that it doesn't surprise me that those people still like him. I'm a little bit surprised that I see younger people wearing Nirvana t-shirts, He's one of he's not as big with young people as, big hip hop star is or anything like that, but there is a cohort of younger people to whom he still speaks. And that's just certain creative people can do that. Like I say in the book, the analogy I keep coming back to is the way Catcher in the Rye keeps appealing to subsequent generations of people, even though the cultural references of it are totally passé. There's something about the inner life of the character, and I think it's the same about Kurt's thing about what it is to be a man, kind of trying to redefine masculinity and define yourself with pride as an outsider against a world that doesn't seem to make much sense, and make that feel okay. He's just one of those artists that was able to do that, But I'm not really surprised that he's still. I knew it at the time. Once Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, it was kind of clear he was one of those guys.
This will be my last question, and then I'll be glad to open it up. Tell us a bit about writing the book. Tell us about your own emotional experience, and tell us about highlights of talking to other people about Kurt. I know Courtney was helpful. Did Frances Bean?
I didn't reach out to Frances because, it's a memoir. It's not a biography of Kurt. It's a memoir of the 3.5 years during which I knew him. So I don't deal with his earlier life. And I didn't call people that knew him long before I did, because I was just trying to talk to people to trigger my own memory and to create other voices describing things that I was involved with. And she was, like 2 years old when he died. So, I remember her as a baby, and my daughter and her would play together sometimes, but there was nothing to talk to her about from that time. She wouldn't remember anything, I'm sure, from being a 2-year-old. The good part of it was that there were a lot of people that were just bursting with great love for this guy. The thing we didn't talk about is he was just such a sweetheart. Not everybody who's brilliant is a nice person. I would say most of them aren't, but he was. He was very, very sweet to the people around him. He was very, very sweet to me. And there were certain people that were just so happy to talk about that side of him. Thurston Moore, certainly one of them. Chris, certainly one of them. And other people that aren't famous, but people that were at the record, at both Sub Pop and at Geffen, who were just bursting with joy. They've treasured these anecdotes all these years. So that was really a pleasant surprise in the process. And obviously, reliving his death every day since I started writing the book is kind of a bummer. But he was already dead. It wasn't like that was news to me. I've lived with that as anybody does when they're close to somebody who kills himself at a young age. So I just had to get it done. I had a deadline. The condition of the deal was that it come out proximate to the 25th anniversary of his death. I knew when I wrote the proposal that was sort of the target. That seems to work with publishers, and it was, if I was ever going to do it, this was the time to do it. And then I just did it in like 8 or 9 months. So I was just sort of in a trance. And, I just am glad I got it done. I did the best I could with it. I definitely, as you know, I reread certain parts of it now and certain word changes I would make. But
one thing I want to say about Danny, maybe it's due to David Letterman, but there's like this thing in our culture that record company executives are scum, and you can't really think that if you know Danny. Like, he's the only record company executive I know well, but when you leave here tonight, if you learn one thing, you learn that not all record company executives are scum. Who's got questions?
I'm so moved by that.
You want to go to the mic, or you want to give people the mic?
There you go. Was Kurt ever diagnosed with bipolar or manic depression?
Not that I know of. I'm not sure that word bipolar was just part of regular conversation then. I don't remember it being part of the conversation when I knew him. But, he was definitely prone to depression. There's no question about that. And that didn't start when he became famous. You know, Chris and Butch Vig, who produced Nevermind and produced the demos the year before, you know, both told stories even in the studio where he would just kind of zone out for 20, 30 minutes at a time and then just kind of come back. So he was definitely prone to depression. That I feel through my own observation. No, but he met with a lot of doctors, that's for sure. He had this chronic stomach pain that bedeviled him during the years I knew him, and again preceded being famous. And he was prone to depression. And then he, you know, once he was successful, you know, people, you know, say, well, gee, did success make him do heroin? No, he had done heroin before he was successful, but it's a lot easier to get heroin after you're successful. So, you know, he met with quite a few doctors. I'm not aware of what the diagnoses were, but I don't think it's a bad guess. He definitely, antidepressants was one of the many pharmaceuticals that he tried, various antidepressants, they, you know.
Good evening. Stylistically, how would you describe Kurt Cobain's music? And what do you think his influences were? And what makes him so unique and so special? I mean, I've been hanging around the New York music scene since the early days of Max's Kansas City, Andy Warhol, you know, Alan's Suicide, the Dead Boys, Johnny Thunders, who I'm making a film about. Now, what makes him special, and what are his influences?
Can I just say, I saw Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers at Max's, and it was the early show, and it started at 11:45 because he was getting his stomach pumped before the show.
Was that in 1971 that I filmed? 1979 I filmed?
I'm not old enough for that, thank you.
Oh, okay, well, okay. But at any rate, you know, Johnny Thunders comes to mind when I looked at Kurt Cobain, you know, similar drug problems, similar style of music and so forth. Do you see any relationship there between New York music at that time, you know, Velvet Underground and so forth?
Well, I mean, he certainly was aware of that music. I don't think those were the bands that, when he was a teenager in the 1980s, that had the biggest influence on him. I think there was another wave of American punk, of bands that I mentioned earlier, like Black Flag and Flipper and, you know, many, many others that came on later, many of them from the West Coast, but also Fugazi was from Washington, D.C., and those were just more the bands that were the most influential on him as a teenager, from what I understand. Culturally, you know, the 70s punk, both in the United Kingdom with bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and the New York scene that you're describing came about a decade earlier than that. So he knew about them, but they weren't, when he and the other members of Nirvana were always trying to wear T-shirts of bands that they admired. It wasn't those artists. It was more likely to be the Pixies or you know, Flipper or one of these later punk acts that kind of emerged during the Reagan years, where that's when he was in junior high school and high school, you know, and that's usually the imprinting time for most of us. But he was also a Renaissance guy when it came to music, and loved the craftsmanship of pop. He was also, you know, Chris and the sound guy, Craig Montgomery, they were in vans traveling around the country hours and hours and hours, going from one gig to the other, and everybody described that half the time they're playing punk music and the other half the time they're playing, you know, the Beatles or the Smithereens or Cheap Trick, because he did love melody. And that is something different about him as a songwriter from the artist that you're describing, because he wrote hit songs, which they didn't. I think culturally there's certainly some of the rebelliousness. You can certainly see the relationship between those artists like, you know, the Dolls and others, and Nirvana. But the Dolls never had a song on the radio, and Nirvana, once Smells Like Teen Spirit was on the radio, had about 10 in a row. So he had this other talent that other punk artists didn't have, as well as sort of a sense of identification with the punk rebelliousness. That's what differentiated him from them. But there's no question that he also respected that culture because he came out of it.
Well, I think if there was one band that you couldn't say some of those things about, it was The Clash. Was there a particular, did he like The Clash?
I don't remember him talking about the Clash, but you know, he might have. Again, I just think generationally they came along earlier. So I'm not aware of that, but you know, I just know what I know. I don't pretend to know everything he cared about. I just know my interactions with him.
Thank you. Hello. Can you talk a little bit about where Kurt's music, if you know, where he thought he was going to take his music? Was he going to stay with Nirvana? Was he branching out into other things? Oh, and unrelated to that, thank you for the No Nukes concert. I grew up in a Springsteen, Jackson Brown household, and that concert was a very big deal in my house, so thank you for that.
Cool.
Danny produced the movie No Nukes.
Produced
Exactly.
and directed.
And directed, yes.
Me and my friend Julian.
Movie director Danny Goldberg
We
here with us.
did. Me and my friend and partner in that venture, Julian Schlossberg, produced and directed it. Obviously, it's speculation. You know, he certainly was talking about at least doing some things outside of Nirvana. I think the Unplugged gave him a chance to experiment with acoustic instruments. There's no question that he had talked to Michael Stipe of REM about doing some demos together. Those demos never happened. Kurt didn't, as Michael Stipe said in an interview shortly after Kurt died, you know, Kurt never got on the plane to go and do that. You know, my guess is that he would have, you know, that the artist that maybe would have been a model in terms of the way he handled a career might have been somebody like Neil Young, who does things on his own, and then he would do things with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young again, and then do things with Crazy Horse. I mean, I would imagine Dave Grohl also would have become frustrated by not being a lead singer. I mean, I had no idea how talented Dave Grohl was. I always say I would have spent more time with him if I had known. But Dave knew. You know, Dave had this guy inside him that's now a global star. That, you know, and so, you know, my guess is they both would have done things apart and they still would have come together. But that's a guess. No one knows.
Hi. Are you familiar with Brett Morgan's Montage of Heck, the documentary?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that, kind of especially with respect to Buzz Osborne's comments that it was basically like 90% bull. And I know kind of when I thought of that, it kind of makes me think of like Kurt the legend versus Kurt the man and how those things can kind of divulge and get a little confused.
You know, part of what was in my mind when I wrote the book was to give another portrait of him that was different from the one in Montage of Heck, because that's so dark. I think Brett Morgan's a sincere artist. He didn't know Kurt, but I think he's seriously trying to make a good film and do it in an artistic way. And certainly Courtney and Francis, you know, cooperated with him and provided him with the footage and, you know, and so on. I think it's a valid work of art from a sincere director, but it's a very dark view of Kurt, and it focuses so much on his addiction and the dark side, and not on how brilliant he was, and not on how sweet he was when he wasn't fucked up, and he, you know, and I felt it was a distorted portrait of him, and I wanted to. I'm not saying mine is accurate. Kurt was different with everybody, and there's 50 different portraits of him that could equally be true, but I wanted to add one to it that was more focusing on his talent and the sweeter side of him. Buzz has his own separate group of grievances with it because he knew Kurt early. Buzz Osborne, for those who don't know, is still the singer of the Melvins, which were the prior to the members of Nirvana, the only band that anyone ever heard of that came from Aberdeen, and were a huge influence on the formation of Nirvana. The Kurt and Chris, before they had the band, would come and see Melvin's shows, and Buzz would give them mixtapes turn them on to punk music. And Dale, the drummer of the Melvins, ended up playing with Nirvana many times, and so on and so forth. And when I was at Atlantic, I signed the Melvins, and the one record that Kurt ever took credit on as a producer is that Melvins record, Houdini. Buzz wouldn't talk to me for the book. I reached out to him. I would have loved to have gotten his views. I think, in the Kurt universe, there's sort of the pro-Courtney people and the anti-Courtney people, and I'm a pro-Courtney person, which limited my appeal to the anti-Courtney people, such as Buzz. But I think his complaints also included some of the earlier stuff in Kurt's life, which I know nothing about. I have a lot of respect for Buzz Osborne. He's a real artist, and I think he means well, but I don't know exactly, what he thinks of me right now, or of this sort of more Courtney-friendly version of Kurt's life. But Kurt did marry her and live with her till his dying day, so that says something about what Kurt wanted. But the montage effect thing to me is a distortedly dark and limited version of Kurt. The footage is what it is, but how he edited it, how he chose it, I think is myopic.
Hi, you alluded to a little earlier to a bit of a rivalry between Kurt and Pearl Jam, or at least how he felt looking at them in the charts and so forth. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Kurt and Nirvana related or interacted with the scene in Seattle and the other bands there, to the degree that they did at all.
Well, I think that, first of all, I never spent that much time in Seattle, just to be clear. I lived in Los Angeles at the time, and when they came to meet, they came down there. So, it's not like I myself am particularly knowledgeable about what was happening in the Seattle rock scene from which Nirvana emerged. I think he had a lot of people in Seattle that he really liked, and some of the members of bands there. Certainly Mark Lanigan of the Screaming Trees was a good friend of Kurt, someone he really liked a lot. Mark Arm of Mudhoney was somebody he really respected and liked a lot. Those are two people I heard him talking about as people that meant a lot to him. And I think he really respected a lot of the musicians there. He didn't like being perceived in the media as part of a scene. He didn't particularly like that word grunge because, he didn't like being put in a category. He saw himself as an individual artist that was not defined by geography or other artists like that. So he bridled when people ever tried to lump Nirvana in with other bands. When that movie Singles came out, Cameron Crowe, asked for Nirvana to be on it, and Kurt didn't want to be part of it because he just didn't want to be, he didn't see himself again as part of a group any more than the Beatles saw themselves as part of the Liverpool sound, That was, I think, the way he felt. But individually, I think he really liked a lot of the musicians from there. The ones that he mentioned to me are the ones that I mentioned to you. The Pearl Jam thing was not a genuine, first of all, he got to like and respect Eddie Vedder personally, for sure. He did say some things in the first Rolling Stone article that Michael did, disparaging about Pearl Jam, which they didn't like and which was kind of petulant on his part. I didn't think that was his greatest moment. I do think he felt a sense of competition with them, and there's no question that they were the two big bands from Seattle. And by the time In Utero came out, Pearl Jam's had become commercially bigger. And I don't think he particularly liked that. I don't think he particularly liked when Time magazine did a cover story. It was Eddie Vedder on the cover, but it wasn't personal. He just had that type of competitiveness that successful people, often have. And he moved back to Seattle, for the latter part of his life. So I think he liked that community. I think he was inner-directed. I don't think he was a creature of any particular scene or community, but he had a lot of fondness for a lot of people there, as far as I could tell.
Yeah.
Hi. Ooh. I do a lot of environmental activism and art activism, and I was actually very influenced by like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and a lot of the L7, the Riot Girls during the scene. And I know he was active in deforestation and like trying to get hemp and also free Tibet. How did this affect him while you were friends with him, or because I thought the albums were incredible, and I actually bought many of those like albums because they had tracks, and you know I knew the money went to a good cause, even though I was like just a little teenager. But it really did change my perception. I actually was able to like put myself out there, even though I was like a shy teenager. How did you feel about this? And I really wish this part of Kurt was known more. And I've said this even to like my meditation teacher. No, Kurt Cobain was an activist. I know, because I was personally affected by his life. And I'm glad you wrote this book to show this part of him.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a chapter that I call Citizen Kurt, just about that side of him. He certainly was very influenced by the Riot Girls culture. He lived in Olympia after Aberdeen, but before Seattle. Lived with Toby Vale, who was in Bikini Kill for a while, and already had these strong abhorrence for macho behavior, for bullies, for sexists, for homophobes, and it shows up in a lot of his songwriting. I mean, obviously, Polly is a searing anti-rape song, and but so is even the lyrics of In Bloom and a lot of other songs are very commenting, particularly on the odiousness, as he saw it, of macho behavior, and he was really, I think, consciously playing a different role as a rock and roll frontman than the generation of rock stars that had come right before him. He tried to walk a line. He didn't want to become known as being overly polemic. He always used to say, I don't want to be like our band to be like the Dead Kennedys, known just purely as a political band. But once they became successful, I think he had this sense of obligation to himself and to the community to take a stand on certain things. And certainly early on, they did this Rock for Choice benefit that I described earlier. That was within weeks of Nevermind coming out. And that was for the Fund for Feminist Majority. And in September, just shortly after Francis was born, Nirvana headlined the benefit in Oregon that the film director Gus Van Sant had approached me about getting Nirvana to do to oppose a homophobic anti-gay ballot initiative in Oregon. And that appearance raised both money for the cause, and the ballot initiative was defeated. But a few years earlier in Oregon, an anti-gay thing had succeeded. These ballot initiatives are weird because a very small number of people vote, so an impassioned minority can get a law through. And then on the liner notes of incesticide, he said, anybody who's racist or homophobic or sexist, please don't buy our records, please don't come to our concerts. And he had a clear sense of his role as a star in saying what he stood for. And unlike some people from the punk world, he was no anarchist. He voted for Democrats. There's this wonderful quote I found from him where he said, Republicans are evil. And he voted in 1992 for Jerry Brown in the primaries and for Bill Clinton in the general election. And he saw that as part of his sort of obligation as an artist. He didn't want to overdo it. He didn't want to become Rage Against the Machine or The Clash. And because he also, as he said to me, I want people to know we have a sense of humor. He cared about music and entertainment and the inner life of people. So he tried to walk a line. I think he liked the way R.E.M. had done that. He was a little more outspoken on political issues than R.E.M. was, but he was in that lane as opposed to the extremely political lane, but he was definitely never shied away from saying how he felt about the issues of the day, and saw that as part of his job.
Danny, what about that story you tell where you were speaking at the synagogue?
Doesn't that speak to this?
Well, this was more just how nice he was. I was chairman of the foundation board of the ACLU when I lived in Los Angeles and stayed in that role for a while, but when Eric was doing his Atlantic Monthly story. But when I lived there, I was often would do public events on civil liberties issues, and a rabbi at UCLA asked me to debate a right-wing talk show guy named Dennis Prager about the separation of church and state. It was a super nerdy thing to do at this Hillel Center, and I didn't tell anybody, any of my friends I was doing it, and never liked to mention it in the office because I didn't want the people who worked for me or the artists I represented to feel like, you know, they had to agree with me about political stuff. My role in that was to represent them, not to talk them into things, but to do what they wanted. And I was flabbergasted. I looked out at this audience, you know, maybe approximately this size, you know, the kind of people that would come to a Hillel discussion with Dennis Prager, and Kurt and Courtney were sitting there. Somehow they'd found out I was doing this, and I didn't do very well. This guy, Dennis Prager, is a very sophisticated debater, an odious person who represents to me the dark forces. He's still on the radio. But, you know, a much more practiced debater, and I really felt that I'd done a mediocre job. But in the middle of it, Prager gives this hypothetical. He says, well, hypothetically, you know, if you saw a bunch of people coming down the street and you know, if somebody told you they were religious people or non-religious people and it was a dark night, who would you feel more unsafe with? So I'm kind of like a deer in the headlights with this particular question. And while I'm trying to think of some fucking answer, Courtney pipes up saying, well, if I wanted to have an abortion, I'd feel a lot safer if they were not religious Christians, I'll tell you that. And everybody looks around. So, you know, my main memory of that was not so much the political content of it, was just how nice he was to me afterwards, because I was really bummed out afterwards. We went to this deli called Cantor's on Fairfax that he liked to go to that was near his apartment, and he just kept trying to cheer me up. It was like this role reversal. Because he was notorious for after a Nirvana show saying that they sucked, when they almost never sucked, but he was always so hard on himself. The whole band was, it wasn't. So this time I was feeling I had sucked and he was cheering me up. So that's to me more about what a sweetheart he was than anything political.
Give it to the woman over here. We've only had one woman.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to thank you. Your talk was evocative for me. It brought up the genius and the tragedy that followed. How I wish that you brought some music, the power of music with few phrases to bring about the whole world. Can you say something about the way Nirvana, and if it is in any way reflected in the work?
It's an interesting question, the word Nirvana.
You know, I tried to engage Kurt in discussions about Eastern spirituality from time to time, because that's kind of what I identify with. I'm more of a Hindu devotional, be here now guy than a Buddhist influence. Courtney sees herself as a Buddhist and has been into Buddhist chants all these years. He certainly knew what the word meant, because he said so in a few interviews. He didn't make a big deal of it. There was a punk journalist in England who thought that he was using it to mock spirituality, but he wasn't. He knew what the word meant. He thought about those things, but he never fully connected internally with a spiritual path that liberated him from his depressions or his sense of despair. You know, music has a life all of its own and has a way of speaking to people in a different language. I'm not a musician, but I sure admire it. That's why I work for them, you know. But it's a magical name, no question about that. But he rarely spoke about it. But there's a couple of interviews he did where he did define it, and it was clear he wasn't making fun of it. that he respected it, but it was sort of there in the background, not in the foreground of the way he connected with his audiences.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, dude. Much appreciated.